Hey everyone, I am joined by Scott Wasson today from the RTG Radeon Technologies Group at AMD. We have at least 2 videos with Scott. This is one of them. I think the other one's coming out later. Scott, we're going to be talking about VR stuff today.
Great.
So VR benchmarking in particular, we just did this with the 1700 and the 7700K. And as I understand it, you've got quite a bit of experience with VR testing in your own labs.
Yeah.
Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Computex Conference, which runs from May 30th to June 3rd in Taipei, Taiwan this year. Computex is the biggest event of the year for PC hardware and technology, where we preview the newest prototypes before they come to market. We highly recommend attending or following this event online for industry professionals and enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. Yeah, so first thing here, if anyone is not up to speed, we had an article on the 2 CPUs. More or less, the result was these things provide a good experience, but we had some interesting metrics to go by. So one is frame times, which you're very familiar with. Frame times at a hardware level and a software level. We had bar graphs where one of the metrics was unconstrained FPS, and that's one where I'm on the fence how useful that is. Delivered FPS, how much goes to the headset, drop frames, and average frame times. So it's a big topic, but where do you want to start in terms of, I suppose the topic for us today is how should we be interpreting this type of data going forward?
Yeah, so VR is a little different than regular games in terms of how we think about performance, and it gets really complicated really quick. We should probably go through some basics.
Right, yeah.
The Vive and the Rift are the 2 headsets out now. Both of them update their displays at 90 hertz, 9 times a second. Right? And they run vertical refresh sync. So it's like having VSync on your PC monitor, right? And so that's as fast as you're going to go, right? But you need to go that fast all the time, or you fall down because you lose your orientation and you bang your head, and it's bad, right? It's really bad with VR not to hit your performance targets. Way worse than just sitting at a display, right? And so the question is, how do we think about performance in this type of scenario? And one of the key things to understand is you've got 11 milliseconds between each display update on a headset, and we're trying to make sure that we hit that mark, right? And so we really are thinking about getting inside of that 11 millisecond window. It's more about frame times than about FPS, given that your window is that. Right. There are also some other issues with VR headsets that mostly the headset guys have done a good job taking care of that have to do with input to response latency. And I'm not talking about the type of input lag when you move your mouse and the display moves, but when you move your head and then you get an update, because your sense of equilibrium requires something. I think this is some of the sort of evaluations that I've seen from like John Carmack when he was testing. He was tweeting about a 20 millisecond latency between the movement and the response. You go above that and people start to get sick, right? So they have to be quick in that regard, which is a little bit bigger than most of the metrics that we're talking about, which are sort of frame-to-frame intervals with the GPU and CPU and software, along with the various. There's another layer of software that runs on a headset to get the image ready for the headset display.
Yeah, you've got the runtime in there.
And they do some things, which is a little weird and spooky stuff, but just to make sure that your sense of balance doesn't get messed up. So I see in your article here the metrics that you're using are FPS instead of frame times.
Well, we've got frame times as well.
Yeah, and they're NVIDIA FCAT VR numbers.
Yes.
Right. And NVIDIA, went and built a tool to help people test this stuff. We've actually been testing VR performance in our labs at AMD without those tools and producing somewhat similar metrics for a while. And there are capabilities built into Steam VR and the Rift runtime to allow for collecting these types of metrics. Right. So we could talk about a few of the metrics and what they mean.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one item of note here is from a testing standpoint, which we didn't talk about too much in the content. A testing standpoint, this VR benchmarking is really interesting because you may agree with this, but I can sit down and run benchmarks in front of a monitor all day. But with VR, once you start getting into those lower end cards that really aren't meant to be doing it,
it's uncomfortable.
It's like physiologically taxing.
Yeah, it is. It is. In fact, in the labs, we have guys who I've been working with them, and I like told them, under a certain performance level, just put "this doesn't work" and stop testing, so that you can be productive, and not lose your lunch. Right. So there's a certain point where you just know, okay, we're not meeting the standard here, and beyond that, we don't need a number. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Just don't bother, because like you were saying, with stuttering in traditional gaming, it's not a great experience, but it's not going to hurt you. Like you're just going to be upset. You're not going to be sick.
Right.
So with this, one of the questions on the frame time plots I have, so we've got, like you said, it's FCAT VR generated.
Mm-hmm.
We use hardware capture to theoretically validate that. And we can see like we've got hardware capture lines that more or less coincide with the software capture when there's a spike. So there's a rough 11 millisecond window. Now, on the Rift, so from my understanding, does Oculus do something where it stretches out that 11 millisecond window a little bit? Like, so you've got some extra time because they're doing something funky in the runtime?
Well, okay. So you have an 11 millisecond interval from frame to frame.
Right.
That's different from your input to response latency.
Right.
You can add more buffering in order to sort of smooth out make sure you hit all your intervals, but you're adding latency on your input to response side. And my understanding is that philosophically, Oculus does a little more buffering than the Steam VR guys do, right? But even on Steam VR, there's some overlap between like CPU work and GPU work, so that you do wind up having kind of a 13 millisecond window, I think, on Steam VR for individual frames, even though, because of the buffering, right? Even though it's 11 milliseconds for your display window. So it gets complicated, but yes, there's some differences.
Oh yeah, because we saw in one game, for example, Arizona Sunshine, which had some controversy around it when it launched for its Intel integrations, but that game in particular, we saw the most drop frames on that one out of all of them, and it was about 100 drop frames. Drop frames, I suppose we should define as updating head tracking, but not necessarily animation.
So you want to talk about drop frames?
Let's go down that path for a second and then come back. Yeah.
So in Steam VR, there's a metric for drop frames, and you can take the input or output from their stuff, and they have drop frames. Their definition, as I understand it, of a drop frame is two things have to happen. First of all, your GPU is not fast enough or CPU, the combination of the two is not fast enough to render the frame within your 11 or 13 millisecond interval, right? And then something else has to happen, which is there is a sort of a fix-up built into the Oculus runtime and into Steam VR. Actually, there are two different fix-ups, but Oculus has asynchronous time warp and asynchronous space warp, and those are about, like you said, taking the input from the head tracking and also actually taking the prior frame that we completed and rendered and basically saying, okay, we've moved over here, here's the old frame, let's warp it so that we can change the position. The reason that you do that and then display it is so that the user gets some feedback, some visual feedback. Yes, we know you moved your head. Yes, the position has changed here. It's not perfect like rendering a new frame, but warping is better than nothing. My understanding of drop frame prior to FCAT VR release was that we failed to warp, and so we both didn't render a new frame and we didn't get the warp frame out. Steam calls it reprojection. There's asynchronous time warp and then a newer method, asynchronous space warp on Oculus. Missing those entirely, you're going to have a very perceptible miss. If you actually use a reprojected or space warp frame to substitute, you may not perceive it at all. So a drop frame to me was always a very perceptible thing.
Right.
The way the metric is being defined by this tool, it actually isn't a big deal. And what we call a drop frame, they're calling a warp miss.
Yeah. So a warp miss for them is drop frame with these tools is when you do have the head movement update. And a warp miss is when you lose that warp, hence their name, warp miss.
Right.
And you don't update animation, you don't update anything really. You're replaying an old frame. without updates, and that is, by definition of this tool, the thing that you really need to look out for as a bad experience.
Right.
But so as you're saying, Steam VR's tools, it sounds like, define these things differently.
That's my understanding, and honestly, I don't really want to argue about semantics.
Right.
But it's important to understand that. Right, and there's some value attached to this. Right. It turns out that if your headset is capable of doing a space warp frame before it comes out, then you kind of can patch for a performance deficit, and so it isn't necessarily a bad experience.
Right.
A lot of these tools, there's a lot of red in the graphs and stuff around their version of a drop frame, and you may never perceive that.
Yeah, well, and then we've also got other metrics. So, well, I guess going back to the Arizona Sunshine path, before I forget, that one was where we saw, so first of all, 0 warp misses, 100 drop frames, which out of 5,400 intervals of 1 minute, 60-second cycle times 90 hertz, 5,400 intervals. Out of 5,400 intervals, 100 drop frames by FCAT VR definition, that would be something like 1.85% of all frames delivered. But they're not too closely clustered together. So the question there is, at what point when we're looking at this stuff do we say this is bad as a user experience? And obviously you have to actually look at the headset, right? But from a reader perspective, where you don't have the experience we do, short of looking at our hardware capture, how do you look at a chart and say, I can tell this is unpleasant?
Right. Yeah, but this is new territory. And one thing that we're doing is there's literally red, yellow, green. Because every test is not automated. Every test is someone playing a game,
right? And
they're reporting their experience. And so part of what I've asked the lab guys to do if they're reporting is just say, is it red, yellow, or green? And if it's a good experience, it's a good experience. If it's sort of iffy, then we know. And if it's not good, then fine. But we'll take the numbers after we see that subjective evaluation, sort of understand. It is kind of coming into the shape now that we have enough experiences and numbers together to start to get a feel for that, right?
Right.
If you spend too much time warping, and it becomes a compromised experience, and you can notice. Right. And there are some thresholds that we're starting to get an idea about. And I'm not sure I can tell you off the top of my head yet what they are, but I think that will come into focus. But the big thing whenever you're evaluating VR or any other gaming experience is really, at the end of the day, is it subjectively a good experience for me, right? Yeah. And so the numbers are good to have, but they do need to track with.
Still needs a writer behind them.
Yeah. Right, and with VR it gets complicated because they can, with the warp, patch over some things that you would think might be a bad experience, right?
Yeah, well, that's especially with like the space warp and time warp stuff and all the tricks that are played. And not tricks like a bad thing, tricks that are generally a good thing.
Yeah, they help out. Yeah.
Right, so it makes it difficult. Now, another set of numbers we had were these, like we were starting with the delivered FPS, unconstrained, all that. So the first one I want to talk about is unconstrained. My stance in the article and the video was more or less, here's a number, it's generated by taking 1,000 milliseconds and dividing basically by the average frame time, which is not a perfect way to achieve it. But the idea that FCAT VR has behind unconstrained FPS is saying we can use this as a means of measurement where in traditional gaming you turn VSync off and you run the benchmark, so you're unconstrained, hence unconstrained FPS. The problem is we are constrained and there's no bypass to it, at least not one that you would do as a user because you're at 90 hertz for the headsets. So when we're looking at 230 versus 200 FPS unconstrained, how valuable is that metric? Because my stance right now is I don't know, but here's the data.
Right. Well, this is kind of a weird one for me.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, what they're doing with the unconstrained FPS metric is they're taking the average frame time and they're converting it into an FPS number, like you said. And it's simple math. But the thing that is probably more relevant is actually the average frame time. And there's a point to be made about that, which is if your average frame time is whatever it is, you've got like 4.3 milliseconds here. there's going to be a wait before it's time to produce the next frame. And that happens on these intervals because everything else, the display has to be updated, then you're dispatching a new frame, and there may be some overlap in buffering, but it is what it is. But if your average frame time is relatively low, then the GPU could potentially spend a little time sitting idle, right? Whereas in a no VSync, no VR situation, when you have 240, 500 frames per second, right, everything's buffered up, all the GPU power is being used, it heats up, all these things happen that are not happening in this scenario. So I think they used unconstrained FPS probably just to make this more understandable to people who think in terms of FPS, but it's not actually probably going to give you the same number as if you were to turn off VSync on the headset, because the performance factors are different. And to me, I would rather talk about average frame time. Okay. Having said that, there's also a question of, does it matter if your average frame time is really low when you know that your headset is going to have an 11 millisecond interval between updates all the time?
That's the next question,
right? And to some extent, the answer is no, it doesn't matter. If you're good enough, you're kind of there.
That's all that matters for the most part.
However, I think what we've seen in the lab is that the average frame time is a nice predictor of what will happen. The closer you get when that edges up, to 11 milliseconds or whatever it needs to be, when you have a higher average frame time, then you're more likely to spend time warping frames, or reprojecting, or space warping, or whatever, or maybe even dropping / missing, as I would define it. It's hard when the industry hasn't completely decided on what to call them, but average frame time is an indicator of the overall performance of the system. And it's GPU and CPU both that contribute to that. So I think it's still a useful measurement of headroom, but I don't like the terms in which it's being delivered, because I don't think it tracks with reality.
Sure. Yeah, and I think with the unconstrained FPS, my thought on that is from perhaps a standpoint of getting people used to the idea of benchmarking in VR. Obviously, frame times have been done, so it's not like it's a new thing, but it's also, people are still getting used to it on the consumer side, even on the media side. So you look at an FPS number, that's a nice number, right? It's a bigger bar, so it's better. That's what you think. So it makes sense from a standpoint of trying to condense this into something that is more easily presentable to the audience. But like you're saying, I'm not sure that it's, I think it's better, at least for our audience, where I know all of you viewing have the ability better to get used to the frame times versus time chart to see a better reading of performance.
I think so. And there's also some weird things about the perception when you start doing a lot of math on something. This example, 200 versus 229 frames per second sounds like a big delta. But when you're looking at frame times, it's 4.3 versus 4.9 milliseconds. And it's like a teeny amount of time difference between these two solutions.
And for that particular test, we had a test-to-test variance of about 0.5 milliseconds plus or minus. So they're effectively the same. Yeah,
so I think that probably, I don't know, if you're really a nerd about this stuff and you're really into it and you want to do it right, I would think in terms of frame time. Yeah.
And then, so in terms of frame times, the same thing we were kind of talking about at a top level, but at what point do you start to care when you're looking at 4.3 versus 4.9? I don't think we really care a whole lot, as long as, assuming there's not some really weird thing going on that's not told by frame times. Assuming that's the only metric that matters, it's not a big deal. But at what point does it become, if we have, let's say, 6 versus 10, where both are still within the window, at what point do we care about that objective advantage if you're not experiencing it in the headset? How good of a predictor is that for future VR performance?
Right. Well, this is like like we do with other games, right? We run one game as a proxy for a whole bunch of other games, right? We got 7 that we tested in a review of a graphics card, but we're going to run 70 on it over its lifetime, and we're just hoping that it all kind of tracks, right? It's complicated and it's hard to know. One of the things about an average frame time, though, is that when you've got these plots here, when you run a game, the frame times vary, and generally, a lower average probably means better overall performance. That may translate into, avoiding this big slowdowns, the spikes in frame times that cause noticeable problems. That would be what you would hope. But you can also simply measure that, and then you've got some of these metrics like drop frames and warp misses and things that tell you the answer to the question.
Yeah, it's definitely important to log drop frames and warp misses. It's just a question of the averages and the unconstrained almost strikes me like a maximum FPS value in a traditional chart, but we'll see how it plays out.
It's an average frame time. It's really kind of an average FPS, but again, it's also not taking into account the way that your GPU waits between frames.
That's what I mean by it. It's like there's so much out of the measurement that's not factored in. Like Arizona Sunshine again, where we're seeing this 1.85% drops with a stock 1700 OC. We were at like 38 drops, which was, I don't even know, is well under 0.5%. But if you look at the average frame times, we're 3.8 to 4, and even in the 1700 stock, which clearly there's an imperfection in testing anyway, because the 1700 is above the overclocked one, so there's obviously imperfection there. Even in that one, the experience was fine. It was smooth. I didn't detect the drops when playing the game. So it's very interesting. We'll have to see how it shapes out, I guess.
Well, this is all new stuff, right? And we're kind of getting a feel for how we think about VR performance and how we measure it, and how all the warping and the interesting things that people are doing affects the user experience. And at the same time, there are new techniques being developed all the time to take advantage of the fact that VR, like you have lenses, and there's sort of, you could have more resolution at the center than at the edges, and so we have, like in Serious Sam VR, some capability for basically showing you more detail in the center of the frame than at the edges.
That's a big concern too. With like the only one I know that does it on the Vive is the Portal tech demo, where the edges of the frame or of your viewport can be lower resolution to help with the frame times. So now you have this other thing that you can't, hopefully it shows up in a metric somewhere, like in Steam VR, that it's doing this lower resolution around the perimeter. But it's another thing that isn't necessarily measured, and if it isn't necessarily going to show up in a bar graph. So now you're back to which I wasn't in the industry when this was going on, but you're back to frame quality. What does the actual picture look like frame to frame?
Well, and if you're doing this type of thing right in a VR headset, if you're saying we need less resolution around the edges, and you're able to sort of deliver that and no one notices, that's a win, and so it's a good thing, In fact, one of the things that is being explored for a lot of this stuff is eye tracking, and then what they call foveated rendering, where you basically render high resolution at the center where the eye is looking, and then lower resolution at the edges of the field of view where the eye's not really focused. And I think that if that's implemented well, it could be kind of like magic. You would not know that their cheating, if you call it that, is happening. And honestly, real-time graphics is all about fooling your eye. It's always been about that. It's anisotropic filtering methods, things like this that we've talked about for gaming, are all about sort of like, how can we give the best result doing the least intensive math to have the best mix of outcomes,
Definition of engineering.
And in the case of VR, there's a lot of work being done to try to give you that wonderful experience without killing your performance. And we need it. GPUs are getting faster at a nice rate. You've got, sort of the Moore's Law transistor thing that happens. But we're talking about 4K per eye or more, and really accelerating the image quality and all that. To make that work, techniques like foveated rendering are going to be a big part of it, right?
Right. Very interesting stuff. So if you're curious about more of this, we have a link to the article below for the primer on all of it. Obviously, there's a whole lot more to talk about, though. And check back for the other content with Scott, where he joined us to talk about some of the reader questions we had. And thank you again, Scott, for joining me.
Certainly.
We'll see you next time.